What induced you to become a master mason?
It was a family tradition. My father was a master mason, and my first knowledge of Freemasonry was his funeral when I was just past my 14th birthday.
So, what attracted you to the fraternity? It ran in your family, but what did you see in the Masons that you knew that made you want to be a part of it?
I was actually sponsored by three very prominent Masons in my hometown. They were my father's brothers. One was the minister of my church. He was a World War I veteran, like my father and my other members of my family. And he was master of the lodge when my father was buried. The other was the president of the bank. And the third guy was the director of the funeral home. And they sort of monitored me along the way through the last 3 years of high school, and they were instrumental in providing funds for me to borrow and go to college without interest. And I paid them back on time, and my sister borrowed the same amount of money 4 years later and did the same thing. So they were father images for me. And to protect them, I took out an insurance policy. And my two uncles were co-signers of my notes, so I made them the beneficiary. And I still have that policy. It's not worth a lot, but it's sentimental. And I changed the beneficiary several times.
That's great. What has Masonry meant to you?
Well, almost all the events of my life, there have been something connected with Freemasonry in it. Even the gentleman that I worked for in the Marine Corps, it was not uncommon for me to have a boss who was a Freemason. And we didn't go to lodge together, but we recognized each other as being Freemasons. Sometimes it wasn't as pleasant as other times, but it was fun, and it helped me to understand life and how to live the right kind of principles.
Tell me about your time in the military. You have been all over the world in the service. About instances where maybe you encountered a Mason out in the field. Do you have any particular stories about running into encountering somebody and finding out that they were a brother Mason, and what kind of relationship ensued from that?
No, I don't really know of any story like came out of Civil War where Masons on both sides communicated with each other. I didn't have any instances like that. Of course, the enemies that I fought against in 3 wars were not inclined to be that sort of fraternal arrangement. The Japanese, although after World War II I had lots of experience with Japanese senior officers, nevertheless, I don't know any who were Masons, yet they have Masonic lodges in Japan now, and they had Masonic lodges in China. One of my seniors at one time was a colonel at the end of World War II, who was fortunate enough to find the jewels of the Grand Lodge in China and return them to the proper place. But other than that, I don't know any stories like that.
Was there a time when you discovered someone you were fighting beside or in a unit with, serving alongside, when you found that person was a Mason? I'm thinking about maybe discovering that instant bond that you can sometimes discover far away from home.
All of them that I was associated with, I knew ahead of time and did not meet on the field of battle. It just didn't happen that way.
I'd be interested in hearing about any memorable North Carolina Freemasons that you have known and anecdotes about them. Who in North Carolina has impressed you, or who has had an impact on your life that you could tell us about?
I don't know anybody specific. I had the good fortune of traveling early with the Grand Masters to the Conference of Grand Masters of North America and having good relationship with them when I was the Sovereign Grand Inspector General. But even though my family is pre-Revolutionary War residents of North Carolina on both sides of my family, I couldn't call myself anything more than a newcomer to North Carolina because I came here to retire after 36 and a half years of active service in the military. So I was a Johnny-come-lately in the Masonic fraternity. I was really surprised that the Grand Commander elected to appoint me deputy in the Scottish Rite because I had not been a member of the Scottish Rite more than about 10 years at the most. I had resisted joining anything beyond the Blue Lodge and the chapter in the York Rite for many years because I was dissatisfied with myself that I was carrying dues cards and not contributing, and it bothered me, and people were pressing on me to join the Scottish Rite and finish up my York Rite and join the Shrine. And my retort was, why should I be phony? Here I am not making any contribution at all, not being a leader or a helper. Why should I commit and fabricate another card? So it was 1971 before I even joined the Scottish Rite and the remainder of York Rite and Shrine all in one package. And I was getting ready to retire. I thought I was a colonel and chief of staff of Camp Lejeune, thinking about quitting. It was nearly 30 years. It was time for me to hang it up. And then I got selected for brigadier and changed the whole thing. But when I retired, I became busy then in Freemasonry, and I was in the real estate business as a broker, and the office help kept saying, "There's a gentleman on the phone who will not leave his number, but he wants to speak to you." And it happened several times. And finally, the girl came in. That fellow's on the phone. and it was Grand Commander Clausen from the Supreme Council. And he said, you know that illustrious Jimmy Johnson is going to retire at the end of the year? I said, yes, sir, I've heard he is. He said, I want you to be his successor. And I said, you got to be kidding me. I don't know anybody in North Carolina to speak of, only New Bern. And he said, don't tell me no. Think about it. And we talked. Finally, I said, well, if you're that hard up, I will take it for a year and I'll let you know whether I like it or not, and I'll bow out and somebody else can have it. And his retort was, General, North Carolina is yours, take command. And he hung the phone up. So that's how, and I got no more communication from him until the Supreme Council met 2 years later. He didn't call me. I didn't call him. And I went to the Supreme Council expecting that they would appoint someone in my place. And when I got to the entryway, there was a person waiting to take me to Clausen. And I went through the crowd, the herd of folks that were there, and into his office. He closed the door and he said, you've been elected SGIG, but I don't want you to say anything about it. Just let it go, because we'll make the announcement at the proper time. And of course, that was ridiculous on his part, because the minute I walked out the door, friends of mine that I'd made in the last 2 years were all waiting out there, particularly Georgia, Tennessee, and Alabama. Those three guys were my mentors in Scottish Rite. Anyhow, that's how I got where I was.
I did want to ask you about that time when you were ordered to take command. What did you do?
I called Jimmy Johnson, who was the outgoing. He'd been 18 years at SGIG. And I called him. I said, Jimmy, you told me that I should go to the Supreme Council meeting, and I went. And the Grand Commander took me to the he had the Grand Master of Ceremonies recognize me and take me to the altar and then to the east. And he came down on the floor and welcomed me. And for what, I don't know, because he said something to me, I've recognized you now, go take your seat and shut up. And I did. What he really wanted, Jimmy said, he wanted you to come by his office and he was going to talk to you. Well, that's why all the telephone calls, but I just ignored him and went home. But I went to see Jimmy. He said, come on up to Morganton. And Gene and I went up, spent the day with him. And he went over a lot of things that I needed to know. And he said, it wasn't announced. He said, we will announce it as soon as you get the parchment from the Grand Commander. And the Grand Commander wrote the appointment and dated it on the Marine Corps birthday. And I inquired of him, is there anything significant about the date you put on my appointment? He said, yes. He knew what the date was, and he did it deliberately. But Jimmy was good to me, in a sense, because he said, I can't give you good advice about who your successor ought to be on record and all that kind of thing. You'll find out. And soon enough, the Grand Commander sent me a letter and said, we hope you live forever, but you won't. And therefore, you need to have on file with me that'll be secreted so that people won't know who they are. I want 3 names of people that could be your successor. Well, I called Jimmy. I said, how do I answer this, gent? He says, you'll find out. You'll find out. And I waited and waited, and then I got a call from Clausen's secretary, Ms. Johnson. And Grand Commander's waiting for your letter designating the people that ought to be on the list for yours to replace you in case you have an accident or something. I said, well, okay, I'll answer you. I put on that list some people that he had interviewed and turned down before he selected me, and I did not know it, and I didn't find out about it for 10 years later. And they were great guys. I don't know why he didn't take them. But that's the way I arrived. I was a novice. I had a lot of fun.
What did you accomplish during that time in North Carolina?
Well, we established a new clinic for learning disabled children at Charlotte. We increased the foundation holdings from about $270,000 to $2.1 million, and at the same time gave about $250,000 a year from our profits that and collections that supported those clinics, the 3 that we then had. We thought we'd done a pretty good job. It's hard to raise money. I was turned down by a lot of folks, and I was assisted by a lot of folks. I guess that's about all. During the time that I was the SGIG, for Clausen, I did a survey of the Masonic population in North Carolina that indicated how they came to be involved, and I did a paper for him that he published in the Scottish Rite Journal, and it forecast that the membership was going to make a turn down, and I think he appreciated it well enough to publish it anyway. The turn down in membership started about 1985, I guess, or 87, somewhere along there. And it started in the Grand Lodge as well. It was a relative movement. And it's gone, I guess, nearly half now. And that has been the characteristic of other non-Masonic organizations, civic organizations, churches. There is a generation of people who have found it uncomfortable joining groups. I don't know what makes the difference. People with better education than mine certainly can figure it out, but there's a generation of people that followed along behind me that didn't see fit to join groups that had good objectives. They went on their own. They did join the negative side, a lot of them, and revolted and that sort of thing. But the good side suffered.
When you did the paper, did you have any prescriptions or solutions in there for the membership decline?
You know, I don't remember. It's been a long time.
Or do you now have ideas about that?
I think the best thing we can do is public service. We don't advertise ourselves well enough by our good works, not by our TV ads. People don't know where the Masonic lodges are anymore, like they once did, and it's part of the growth in population. In time gone by, if a fruit basket was left on the doorstep of a needy family, there wasn't any question where it came from. It came from Masons. And that isn't true anymore. And it's part of the change in our population and the way we live as a nation. So I don't know how best to do that. I'm out of touch. Except through the computer medium, I don't communicate all that much anymore. Don't have the sensitivity of a person walking on the street. I'm out of circulation, so to speak.
What is Masonry at its best? You mentioned the fruit basket on the door of the needy family, but what are other examples of Freemasonry at its best in the community?
I think the ideal way that Freemasonry influenced in the past was the leadership of the several different institutions of the community were also Freemasons. And that isn't true anymore. For a long, long time now, people in high places have avoided being associated with Freemasonry. Ideally, the best influence would be for the prominent leaders to be part of the system. Now, the French chastised me once when I visited them. The sergeant grand commander of the French Scottish Rite said, "You fellows are off on the wrong track." And that was when we started to lose members. Said, "You need to purify your membership. What you need to do is select only people who are prominent leaders and highly educated folks and purify the bottom edge completely. And you won't have as many members, but you'll have a great deal more influence." And I said to him, "What about charity? How then, with the reduced membership, do you maintain the charity that you give to non-Masons, the public?" He said, "Who needs charity? We're all rich." And I said to myself, "Boy, that's not the Masonry that I know. That's not the Masonry I know." But that's the elitism that you find in some of the foreign countries. As a matter of fact, some of the foreign countries, even in the Scottish Rite or Freemasonry, if you're not a Christian, you don't get in. They don't have the flexibility that we have in the Scottish Rite to lay the holy books of the different religions on the table and say which to you is the preferred book on which you become obligated. And if it's a Muslim, he takes the Quran, and we can do it. They can't do it in Europe.
Getting back to that comment from the person in France, do you think we can have it both ways? Can we guard the West Gate more carefully and increase our charity and our community impact?
I think it's possible. We have to work at it, and we have to associate with people so that they recognize that we have something to offer. That's my view.
What would you say to a young man who came to you, who's curious about Masonry, doesn't really know much about it, but is curious and considering joining? How would you describe Masonry to him? What would you tell him?
It's a fraternity of men who really want to help each other and to help society. And it isn't a religion. It's a group of fellows who are willing to commit to each other to do better, live better, and help the community live better. If you're interested in that sort of activity, be our guest.
Wilkerson College and Wilkerson College Lodge are both named for you. What has been your observation of Wilkerson College over the years? And I guess it's just an open-ended question about your observations. Do you see that as a positive force in the state?
I've been told that it is, but I've not seen any. I don't have any means of measuring. All I can do is listen to people who say that the leadership has improved in the lodges where they've sent people to the wardens to the school. I didn't have anything to do with establishing Wilkerson College. People think I did, but I did not. Dan Weatherington was then the chairman of the education committee at Grand Lodge. And one day he surprised me. I lived in Jacksonville. I lived there 25 years, matter of fact, in retirement. He called me and said, for education purposes, we'd like to use your name. And I said, what are you going to do with it? And he said, it will not be disparaging or degrading. We want to use it for education purposes with your permission. And I said, oh, all right, whatever you say. It's all right with me. And I didn't know anything more about what they were talking about until the printed announcements came out about organizing the college. And there it was with my name on it. So what past Grandmaster Tom Gregory, was instrumental in that, as well as several others that contributed at the time. So it was flattering, but on the other hand, they could have selected a lot of other folks that have been more effective if they just tried.
Where do you see Masonry going in North Carolina? Do you see any trends that it's taking?
Yeah, I think we've turned the corner of membership. Several lodges are now getting members and not losing as many. In the long run, this is a sine curve, and it's done that for a century, and it'll come back, and it'll grow. Uh, when people feel the urge to have companions that are obligated to help each other, it'll come back. At one time, Scottish Rite, which I know better, there's a record that about 1900, the Grand Commander at a meeting said that he believed that Scottish Rite in North Carolina was dead. They had, I don't know, maybe less than 1,000 members thereabouts. Maybe 1,900. I've forgotten the exact number, but it was infinitesimal. And he was really disgusted with the circumstance. But then World War I comes along. After the war, people who go and fight side by side form fellowships that when they come home they're looking for something else to replace that. And after each one of the wars had done that, except that the last few wars we have not won them. And there's been public criticism to be less verbal than I ought to be, but the criticism of the wars themselves have destroyed some of the fellowship that men feel. And we haven't had the surge after the conflicts that we've had before. After the Korean War, it was not quite so bad, but we lost the Korean War, we lost the Vietnamese War, we've lost all the others. My son, when he was a student at the National War College, wrote a thesis on this subject. We know how to start wars, but we don't seem to know how to finish them. And they were never allowed to publish it. He went to work for the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, who had been one of the people he interviewed to do the work. And Admiral Crowell said, we can't publish that. We'll set that aside. But it is hard to know how to end a war if you don't have a true objective.
What's your advice to leaders today of Masonic lodges and the Grand Lodge? What's your best advice to a young leader who's just coming in, say, to the east or into one of the warden's chairs?
Make an attempt to have your programs so that the public feels it, so that you're identified in the community where you convene with things that are going on in the community. Don't just go to a meeting and sit in the back of the room. Go be the leader. Go help with whatever philanthropy is going on in the community. Be a part of it, and don't lock your door to the general public. I think that's where we're missing it. Is the public doesn't really know who we are and what we do.
Be visible, be active.
Be visible, be active. Take a long time. It won't happen overnight because we've degraded very badly from that. Everybody in the community knew where the Masonic Lodge was and what they did many, many years ago. If you ask a person on the street, where's the Masonic Lodge? Oh, it's down the street. But not anymore. And in Europe, France particularly, there is no sign on the street. You have to know the address of the lodge, and it's obscure. And that says something about what the Grand Commander said to me. They're not part of the community. And a matter of fact, right now they're having a hard time. They're having a hard time surviving in France.
What qualities would you look for in a man who is thinking about petitioning? Say, if he wanted, if he was asking you about Masonry and you could decide whether or not to give him a petition, what qualities would you look for before you gave him that petition?
I'd like to know whether he belongs to a church. I'd like to know whether he is successful in business. And I'd particularly like to know what his personal conduct is. That above everything else. He could be a millionaire, and if his personal conduct was not acceptable, I wouldn't recommend him. How does he live his life? What kind of family does he have? We don't dig deeply enough, oftentimes. Guess who does? Prince Hall. They work at it. I've been told that sometimes the petition lays 3 years before they decide what they're going to do. Particularly Alpha Lodge, which was a regular black lodge in I believe it's New Jersey. I've forgotten. But the Alpha Lodge was a black lodge, only black members, regular Masons in one of the northeastern. And I had a man visit my lodge in Jacksonville one time, a white man, who had visited Alpha Lodge. And he said to us, I invited him to speak, and he said, anybody ever visit Alpha Lodge? Nobody had. He said, you do good work, but you have never seen work like Alpha Lodge does. And they screen the people that want to be a member better than any place I've ever been. He was really praising him. And of course, he's talking to a bunch of white guys at the same time, that in a time frame where recognition of Prince Hall was sort of down. And it was important in my lodge in Jacksonville that we know how to process Prince Hall or a black regular Mason, because in the military there are a lot of folks who were black who belonged to regular lodges that were recognized in our book, and it was absolutely necessary that we know how to process this. Tyler had to know how to process that. Otherwise, you get in a real jam. And the threat always was, and I kept reminding them about the threat. If a black Freemason comes to your door and your session is already going and nobody has ever seen him before and he has a dues card that is from a lodge that's listed in your book as being recognized by the Grand Lodge of North Carolina, you've got to examine that man, and if he knows the catechism, you've got to let him in. And the reason is, if you don't let him in, he can bring a suit against you for racial prejudice. Even in the 80s, you could have done it and really destroy. And the judge will turn around and say, well, since Central Dallas Lodge is a member of North Carolina Grand Lodge, then the North Carolina Grand Lodge is a racist organization and put it on us. So you've got to recognize that you have to divide these two things. Nowadays, it's not a problem.
It's much easier now.
It's easier now. And they don't come anyhow, do they? No, they don't.
Not much.
I went to Charlotte. Rick Moore asked me to come to Charlotte and say what I'm saying. He assembled, I guess, nearly a couple hundred folks in that big lodge room there at the temple. And this was a long, long time ago when we were faced with the problem at Central Dallas. And he heard about it and he wanted me to come tell those folks over there. And I did. And during the course of my presentation, one guy stood up, said, wait a minute. My lodge is in session tonight, and they're waiting for me to return to tell them what you said. And I have to tell you that they're going to be unhappy with what you've said. And Rick Moore says that my retort was, that's fine, brother. I recommend to you that you go by your church on the way back and get on your knees and then go tell them. And the guy left the room. But a few years later, he came back and he told Rick, I was wrong. And that's before we recognized Prince Hall. He said, I was wrong. I want to come back. I want to be a part. He's a 33rd today. But it took a long time. But he jumped right in and got with the program. Shall be unnamed. He knows.
That was a tough time, and it's good to have that behind us.
What a hard time. Uh-huh. And so many people said, we'll lose membership. It'll destroy us. Not so. And other Grand Lodges that had recognized Prince Hall elsewhere didn't have loss of membership either, because it didn't become a conflict in the lodge. They like doing their own thing, and we like doing ours, and fraternize back and forth, and let it go.
Are we okay on time?
Yeah, as far as I'm concerned.
Okay. I wanted to come back, sort of circle back to the beginning and ask you what Masonry has meant to you, what it's added to your life.
I guess that I could safely say that other than my religious commitment, it's been the center of my life. It's easy to say. Everywhere I have been for eons, Freemasonry has introduced me to the society wherever I was. I've been generously treated without asking for it. Or you go to lodge in Taiwan, or you go to lodge in Okinawa or Australia, or wherever, they greet you, and you're a person. You're not just a visitor. You're one of them, and that's been good for me because of my travels. I had to wait until I was retired to go through the chairs. I've forgotten, I guess, a steward in a lodge on Guam in 1949, but they rotated the officers every 6 months because of the way it wasn't significant. But I got a taste of it, and after the Korean War, I went to the staff in Washington when I worked for General Shepard. You looked at his picture up there. We had a degree team in full dress uniform that the Grand Lodge of Virginia decreed that we could give the third degree to any active duty military person that requested us, and the master wanted us to come to perform the third degree. We could do it. Well, in some ways that was a handicap for me, because when I came to North Carolina and started going through the chairs, I discovered that the ritual was a bit different. And in the ritual in Virginia, I discovered that it was different from when I coached in San Francisco, because the West Coast ritual was different from Virginia, but it was the same as Hawaii. The Grand Lodge of California ritual dominated Idaho and several of the other western states and Hawaii, so they're all the same. Made it pretty easy to coach, but when you come to Virginia and then to North Carolina, I put in a lot of words that ought not to have been there.
Well, as a member of my lodge says, if you get stuck or don't know what comes next, just say something Masonic.
That's right.
Were you made a Mason in Idaho?
Yeah.
Would you say, sort of repeat for the camera that I'm Lloyd Wilkerson and I was raised in, a certain year in a certain lodge?
Yeah. I was entered apprentice and fellowcraft were given to me by Keystone Lodge number 81 in Pocatello, Idaho, and I've forgotten the name of the other lodge. The two lodges gave me those 2 degrees in the same night. And then Keystone 81 gave me the 3rd degree a week later. That was under dispensation from the Grand Master of Idaho, so that I could get all 3 degrees and memorize and recite all 3 catechisms in 30-day leave. And it wasn't easy. But my coach said, if you get the first degree correct, the others will be easy. And he was right. He was a good guy.
That was 1946.
I got the Master Mason's degree on the 15th of March, 1946. What's that, 69 years ago next month, right?
Mm-hmm. What is your advice to a man who's become a Mason? He's in the Blue Lodge, and he's considering Scottish Rite, York Rite, Shrine. Considering further involvement, going this way or that. What's your advice to him as he's making those decisions?
I think he ought to do one at a time, and he ought to consider who the local people are who lead each of those bodies, so that he can associate with them and become fraternally involved with them, and not just do it for the sake of learning alone. The York Rite is so much older and more deeply involved in Masonic tradition than Scottish Rite is. But Scottish Rite is less restrictive on religion, and he ought to recognize the difference in our country. It isn't true in other countries, but it is in ours. Eventually, I would recommend that he do both. And the shrine is his election. You can cut out what I'm going to say now. My coach in Idaho, the RKO news guy, Bill Musselman, I asked him the question that you've asked me. Do you belong to the Scottish Rite? He said, yes. You belong to the York Rite? Yes. You belong to the Shrine? No. Why don't you belong to the Shrine? He said, why should I spend my life keeping myself in due bounds toward all mankind, and join the Shrine and go to hell? And I said, what do you mean? He says, it's degenerate. And then I went to San Francisco for duty. I left Jean, her little babe, at home, and for a little bit I was living in a hotel downtown San Francisco. Imperial Shrine held the first shrine meeting I ever saw on the streets, and I'm looking out the window of my hotel. And these guys were stealing the policemen's motorcycles. They were drunk and laying in the street, and it was awful. And I wrote a note to Bill, and I said, hey, I understand what you're talking about. But they cleaned their act up, and that was good. And I think they're relatively cleaned it up now, too. I never hear any bad things about them anymore. I don't go, but I belong to all three of the shrine orients, I guess, whatever it is. Yeah. They're honorary, two of them, and the others, remember, was Sudan.
Is there any topic on Masonry that you'd like to address that we haven't touched on?
If I had a recommendation, it would be to improve the education about Freemasonry of our members, so that they can communicate with the general public. so many of our members have very little historical knowledge about us and what we are and what we've done in the world. For instance, almost all of the generals that worked for Washington were Freemasons. Almost all the cabinet and all the military senior officers that worked for Franklin D. Roosevelt were Freemasons. Practiced it. They weren't just fly-by-nights. Historically, Freemasonry has had a profound influence on the goings-on in our government. We've got to produce some people who can regenerate that so that leaders aren't dodging. We had one commandant of the Marine Corps who became an apprentice while he was at the Naval Academy as a midshipman. Never pursued it. One of my dear friends, General Wallace M. Green, Jr., and he went ahead and became 4-star and retired and still hadn't done anything. And that guy up there that I called attention to a while ago, and Admiral Arleigh Burke found out about it, and the two of them grabbed him by the arms and said, "You've got to finish." And he did. He finished his work. And he wrote a commentary on that paper I wrote from Clawson. We submitted it to him and let him make a commentary, and it was a good one. He caught a guy. But we got to get back to that sort of thing, where sound advice with moral background comes to the leaders of our country. That's the best I can say.
Is there any one Mason that you tend to emulate or look up to more than others, or any Mason who has served as a Masonic mentor to you that you would like to describe?
I guess General Shepard, the Commandant of the Marine Corps that you see up there, would come near fitting that bill in the military. He lived an exemplary life, and he was a companion of General John A. Lejeune. They both were made Masons in France, well, in Germany, actually, Koblenz, after the fighting in World War I. I never knew this guy, but General Shepard, I knew him from the time he was a 2-star until long after he retired. Knew his family. He was good to me. And I don't think he gave me any privileges that were the result of being a Freemason. I don't mean that. But his conduct was worthy of emulation. And the things that he accomplished and did while I was associated with him made me feel good.
If you know that a man is a Mason, what do you what do you expect of him, or what do you assume is true of him?
First, high morality. You can't be a good Mason and live a terribly ugly life. If you are a Mason and living that kind of life, you're denying your obligation. Well, that's the first thing I look for. And then, what can you accomplish in your home environment? How do you manage your personal affairs? What contribution do you make to society? That's a good measure. We all fall short, don't we?
It's a journey.
You wonder what could I have done better, and it's hard to admit it sometimes. What you could have done that would have been a better solution than the ones you gave.
Is there anything else that you want to touch on?
No, I've lived a happy life. Everything hasn't been roses, but overall, I've enjoyed my journey. And being a Freemason was a major part of that, and being an Episcopalian was the other part. Spent lots of time at the altar, being a chalice bearer and a lay reader. After I was retired. But my church and family and Freemasonry are my life. Best I could say.
That's a great statement. Guys, Sean, is it just us?
Just us.
Okay. Did you hear anything that we should follow up on, or did you have any questions you would have?
No, I don't guess so.
Okay.
General, thank you.
Thank you.
This is
That was quite a time.